On Society Fellow here at the Simons Institute, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome California State Senator Jerry McNerney as our second keynote speaker today. Senator McNerney was elected to the Senate in November 2024 after serving 8 terms in the U.S. Congress. His 5th district includes Alameda County's Tri-Valley area and all of San Joaquin County. McNerney served in Congress from 2007 to 2023, where he was a member of several congressional committees, including the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology and the Committee on Energy and Commerce. He also chaired the Artificial Intelligence Caucus and authored the AI in Government Act of 2020, which laid the groundwork for the federal government's strategic approach to AI. In the Senate, where he is a member of the California Technology and Innovation Caucus, McNerney is the author of 3 groundbreaking AI bills that, if enacted, would each be the first such laws in the nation. SB 7, the No Robo-Bosses Act, would require human oversight of AI systems in the workplace to prevent abuses. SB 813, the Voluntary AI Standards Act, would establish transparent safety and security standards for AI created by independent third-party panels of AI experts and academics. And SB 833 would mandate human oversight of AI in California's critical infrastructure to safeguard the state's transportation, energy, communications, emergency services, and financial services system. Please join me in welcoming Senator McNerney.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. I just have to share that I don't usually speak to an academic audience, so I'm a little nervous, so I hope you guys don't get too rough on me. But you know, my journey is a little bit unusual. I have a PhD in mathematics. The 1-1 tensor generalization of the Laplace-Beltrami operator, that was my dissertation. But I spent about 20 years in industry developing the wind energy technology that you see in Altamont Pass and other parts around the country. And then I was called to run for Congress because of an unjust war that compelled me to make my voice be heard on that issue. But here I am today, and I have a pretty unique perspective on artificial intelligence, government, and so on. But I just want to talk a little bit about what AI is. There's a lot of different ways to describe it, but I think of it as a linear neural network, or a one-way neural network, a directional neural network. It's like, and Professor Allen? Steve. Professor Steve said, you know, the brain is very complicated. There's feed forward, feed backward. There's inhibitors. There's excitation. I mean, all this stuff with AI, artificial intelligence, all just sort of a bunch of rows of nodes and data flowing one way when it's being trained, and then the inference is a little bit different than that. So. But it also consists of compute, the massive computational ability that we have now that we didn't even have 5 years ago. There's also the algorithms that are used and the data. So AI consists of the neural networks, the algorithms, the data, and the compute. So without any one of those 3 or 4 items, we wouldn't have the large language models that we're having today. So what I want to talk about, focus on today, is the AI versus society. What are some of the benefits and some of the harms of artificial intelligence, and how can we help direct that while we still have time to do it? And I'm not a doomsayer, but we do need to get our hands around this emerging technology before it gets away from us in different ways. Some of the benefits, of course, we know those, very effective in some parts of medicine. For example, radiology. I think in other ways, we can see concrete benefits today in artificial intelligence, in education, in industry, in productivity, in energy efficiency. I mean, we can see a lot of benefits coming at us from artificial intelligence, but the harms are significant. The potential harms are significant. Just the other week, Anthropic released a new version that they claim can break into any cyber system and have access to your data, which of course a lot of your data is already out there anyway, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing. But there was a report from Anthropic about a year ago, maybe, that an AI system would consider eliminating oxygen from people that it thinks is going to turn it off. So under certain kind of test conditions. So AI can be harmful. We see, in my opinion, when internal combustion engines came along, before they came along, human beings were doing the hard physical labor that built society. When internal combustion technology came along, we didn't have to do that kind of hard work. We got a little soft. Well, now with artificial intelligence, we see AI being able to do a lot of things that we use our brains to do. And so one of my worries is it going to make our brains get soft? Are we going to have, I used to use maps when I was driving and try and figure things out, try and stay out of car accidents. And now you just turn on your GPS and it tells you exactly what to do. Of course, sometimes you get it wrong. But nonetheless, you don't have to think about where you're going when you're driving. You don't have to worry about those kind of things. So AI is making us softer in our intellectual demands, and I think that's going to show up in society sooner or later as well. Another thing that I've noticed is that some societies are much more willing to accept the intrusion of AI into our lives than other societies. My understanding is that in China, folks by and large are excited about what AI is bringing to their society. Whereas in the United States, in some of the European countries, people are worried. They're worried about that it might cause job displacements, that it might come after your jobs. I mean, there's some college students and graduate students in here. Is it going to make it harder for you to find jobs when you graduate? This is a very demanding problem, and that's one of the reasons why I'm working so closely with labor to find out, or to just how do we prevent AI from causing those displacements? How do we prevent AI from diminishing our value to society? So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in Sacramento. And I want to say, I was in Washington for 16 years. We started working on artificial intelligence. For example, the AI and Government Act was identified, but there were other things, and it just seemed very hard to get anything done in that environment. For example, we had a privacy law, a privacy bill that passed the Committee on Energy and Commerce, which I was one of the senior members. And it passed on a bipartisan basis, and it was pretty good. California, as you may know, has its own privacy law. The bill that we produced in Washington was similar, but not exactly the same. There's some overlap, and there's some areas where the California law was stronger, and there were some areas where the federal proposed bill was stronger. But the speaker from California wouldn't let us bring that bill to the floor because she didn't want California members to have to go home and say, well, I sacrificed your privacy or a little bit of protection to pass this bill, and we would lose seats in the House. So that was basically a political decision and not a policy decision. And those are the kind of things that keep good policy from happening. There's always that political calculation when you try and pass bills in Washington, and that's not so much the case in Sacramento. You may be surprised to hear that. But one of the things that I like about being in Sacramento is that, there's 40 senators, 40 state senators. Each one of us has about 1 million people in our districts. But I like every single one of my colleagues. There's not one colleague that I wouldn't work with, that I wouldn't want to sit down and have a dinner with. And I can't say that about Washington. I mean, there were folks in Washington that the whole, every time you had a conversation, if they're on the other side of the aisle, they just started into a fight. And so it just made life a lot more unpleasant and a lot more difficult. But here, we're able to move forward with our legislation. I've authored a number of bills on artificial intelligence. One of them, the focus really on all three of them is we want AI to be safe and beneficial. So those are the North Star for our legislative goals, is that the result be safe and beneficial. So I have 3 bills in the process right now. One of them, and I'll go over, they were mentioned before. One of them is SB 947. It's called the No Robo Bosses Bill. I proposed this bill last year. It was called SB 7, No Robo Bosses. Basically what it does is it prevents companies from using artificial intelligence or automated decision-making systems from firing people, from demoting people. We also had a provision to prevent companies from using predictive behavior to decide how people's careers are going to go. I think causing harm on people's careers because of a prediction based on their data is not acceptable. So those are the things that particular bill does. It was a struggle to get that bill out of the Assembly, and we got it to the governor's office, and he vetoed it. Now, his veto message was, in my opinion, a little vague, but we've worked on it and reintroduced it this year as SB 947. I think it has a good chance of getting through, but again, you never know when you're introducing legislation, where the snags are going to be. Maybe you'll know in some cases if it's obvious, but in this one, someone might have a problem with the predictive behavior analysis, because they'll say something like, well, what if someone shows signs that they're going to be, a mass murderer? Can you use predictive behavior to punish him? Well, you can't punish him. So there's, and how do you answer that question? So there's always a little compromise, and that's what's happening on that sort of bill. The beauty is that when you propose a bill in Sacramento, it goes through a couple of committees, and then it goes to the floor of the Senate. And each one of these steps, you're collaborating with your colleagues to understand what their objections are, what their ideas are in improving that legislation. And if you think that they're right, you can incorporate it. So it's an improvement process. Every step along the way, legislation that you are compromising is improved. Of course, there's also the possibility that your legislation can be watered down into being a nothing burger, and that happens. But nonetheless, oftentimes, as often as not, your legislation will be improved by the ideas that your colleagues discuss and propose. And then after that, it moves into the other side of the Capitol at the Assembly, and it'll go through a similar process. So by the time the legislation gets to the governor's desk, it has been through that process several times. You get input from several different quarters, and then the governor will either sign it or not, which is another story in itself. And then another bill I have is SB 1011. And this is an idea we got, and I hate to say this here, but I will. We got this idea at Stanford. We want human oversight in our state's utility system. So if you're managing, electricity distribution or water distribution or gas distribution, something that the utilities provide, then it has to have a human being in the loop. And also would prevent the utility companies, and I won't name any because I don't want to be booed. You don't want to have them, you don't want to have the utility companies firing enough engineers so that they don't have the capability to do oversight. So we introduced a couple of provisions to do that. And then I think the most important bill on artificial intelligence is the Voluntary AI Standards Act. It's SB 813. And basically what I want to do is create a standards regime here in California on artificial intelligence. And so why do I talk about standards? Well, I'll just give you an example. Back in the 1970s, 1980s, Mr. Coffee came out with a little coffee maker. You could put it in your kitchen your kitchen cabinet, start your coffee, and then go to work. Well, turns out a lot of people just did that and they didn't turn them off. The coffee makers caused fires. Firefighters were telling me, hey, this is giving our best business is these fires that are started by Mr. Coffee. So standards were created to require coffee makers to turn off after a certain amount of time so they don't cause fires. And the way I see AI, it's causing harms. It's going to cause harms to society. And when those harms happen, there has to be a way to enforce a change in standards so that when you produce an artificial intelligence product, that you don't cause additional harms by something that we already understand how to prevent. And so what this bill does will create a commission in the California state government to oversee the standards committees. We call them AVOs. To oversee the creation of standards committees. And these standards committees will consist of academics, people from industry, so that you have a good spectrum, people from out of state, even people from out of the country, so that you have a good spectrum of input. And if you've been in a standards committee, that you just churn through objections and things that you don't like, and you argue with people, but things get done, standards are created. There's the UL, there's ISO, there's IEEE. I mean, there's all these standards bodies, but we need one for artificial intelligence so that when you produce a product, an AI product, that product can be tested and can go through standards certification process. And that way, when you put your product out in the public, that you'll be more confident that it won't cause harm. And that now, you may not be familiar, but there's a law in the federal books called Section 230, which basically holds internet service providers like Facebook and those harmless for things that people do on their platforms. Now, in my opinion, Section 230 goes too far because it gives those companies complete immunity from harm, from legal harm. But something like that, where if you go through a certification process with your AI product, that you'll have some confidence that it won't cause harm, and that if it does cause harm and you have been certified, that you won't be facing the same level of legal liability as you would otherwise. So those are common sense ideas, I think, that will help make sure that AI is safe and beneficial, as I mentioned earlier. And I want to say it's important to have researchers in the field. It's important to have researchers, academic researchers, to help us understand where AI, artificial intelligence, is going, how it's going to be used, and also to have those researchers be able to communicate with us in Sacramento so that we can put those ideas and that research to work in making sure that our AI is safe and beneficial. So that's basically, that's a function I think you all might be interested in. I guess that's pretty much the basics of what I wanted to discuss. Is there any questions? I'd be glad to take your questions. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. We're going to be starting our Q&A session now, and the way it's going to work is we're going to be passing out note cards and pens for you all to write your questions down on. I will be opening with some of the questions, and Greg and Stephen will be passing the note cards and pens out and handing them to me. Thank you so much.
It's really interesting, though, to see how industry develops. When I was working in wind industry, we started with basically a plain blank piece of paper back in the 1980s, and there was no windmills out there. We put a design together. We got some investors, and we put it in the field. We called the investors, and we turned on the switch, and the thing started, and things came apart, and things were flying everywhere. Everyone was running for cover. And so, I mean, and yet the investor stuck with us. So, you know, you have to move forward. You have to develop your things and learn from your mistakes. And I think we're going to be facing a significant of that with regard to AI. And when we look at AI, there's the large language models that we're all familiar with, GPTs and Claude, and they're very, very powerful. they can lead people to bad behavior. There was an article lately that one of them showed chemists how to make a biological weapon and distribute that, and they can be used as therapy, which is a problem. I mean, there's a lot of ways that these large language models can be used. And the last time I looked, there was about 10 to the 14 nodes and parameters in these large language models, and I'm sure that number has grown since I looked at that. Somebody maybe can tell me how many neural connections there are in the brain, but it's going to be larger. What's that?
I said I can tell you that.
Okay, what is it?
There are approximately 100 billion CNS cells in the brain. They have up to 1,000 hertz in terms of their frequency of connection. They have a synaptic field that is approximately 100 times larger. So you're dealing with approximately 1 trillion connections firing off per second.
So, I mean, I counted up, as you mentioned, it's not like 10 to the 15 or 10 to the 16 possible connections. So,
Well, I haven't given you the whole story.
Okay.
I left out a whole bunch of other things.
well, I mean, the thing I was trying to get at is that you don't have to have a large language model to have harms. I mean, you can develop an AI model with a much smaller load and train it on specific areas that can be useful, but that also can cause harms. I mean, if Claude can break cybersecurity, then you can probably design a much smaller AI model and train it on a much smaller set of data and have it do the same thing. Another thing that people want is some sort of attribution of AI. How do you know, once you have a result, how do you know where that came from? How do you know how to attribute credit or blame? And the answer is you really can't do that with AI. And so there's some theories about how to propose, how to move that forward. I've been to some math conferences where people are talking about that, but I haven't seen that yet. So the public would like that, but I don't see that as a possibility yet. So there's a number of things that are still a little bit farther off, but it's important to put this standards guardrails in place. Standard guardrails aren't the only thing you can do. I mean, for example, protecting children's welfare, we can make specific regulations. Not, I mean, what the standards is not a regulation. It's a voluntary program. So if the federal government says we're going to preempt all regulation, SB 813 is likely to be exempt from that, which is partly how we're designing that. But there's a lot we can do to protect society specifically with regulations. The problem with regulations is that legislation is slow. I mean, it takes maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to pass legislation. As I mentioned, the No Robo-Bus, that was vetoed, so that was last year. So this is year 2 for this. And then if that bill finally passes and gets the governor's signature on it, then we got another year or 2 of regulatory development and enforcement training and so on. So it's regulations are very, very slow. And as you know, AI technology is moving very, very fast. So standards is probably the only thing we have a hope of keeping up with the change in technology. Yes?
So speaking of SB 813, the Voluntary AI Standards Act, we were interested in sort of how the process of writing this bill and also the structure of the bill with the independent verification organizations as well as the security vendors. The AI industry might be well positioned to sort of speak to these questions of science, but science is also really important to building adaptive forms of governance. So I was just curious how you took the influence of like the AI industry into account, any avenues that you have to sort of broaden stakeholder participation.
Well, thanks for the question.
Also, if you wanted to sit, we could also sit.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's more, but then some folks can't see.
Oh, yeah.
But then some folks still can't see. Yeah, the process started before I got to Sacramento. I was in the Congress. We developed the AI and Government Act, and I left Congress. I came to my senses and left Washington. For a year and a half, I sat around thinking about how we can get our hands around this. How can we put guardrails in place? I was thinking of specific regulations, and nothing really made sense. But I've been involved in standards creating bodies in the past, and you know, it's a churning, it's a struggle. You're going to deal with people that you don't agree with, and you're going to have to come to a consensus, and that's how it should be. And then when I got to Sacramento, I was talking to. By the way, I want my two staffers to stand up and be recognized. They're the ones that have really made a lot of this possible. And so they were aware that I had a big interest in artificial intelligence and this specific area. And I think because in Sacramento, when you put feelers out there, you know, folks that are interested in that will contact your office. There's a nonprofit organization that contacted our office and had some specific language that we were able to start on, and then we worked with them to come up with the right formulation that we thought would have a chance of getting through the process, the process in Sacramento. So it's basically an iterative process. You start with an idea, you get input from stakeholders on the outside, and then you start to develop language. And then when you have that, then you can start presenting that language and getting more feedback until you have something you think is worthwhile. And of course, then, as I mentioned, it starts to churn through the legislative process. When you give up things you don't want to give up, and you add things you don't want to add, but if you want to get your legislation through the process and get voted on and get the governor's signature, you have to make those compromises.
Thank you so much, Senator McNerney. And I also wanted to give Aaron and Heather a huge shout out for this event as well, so thank you so much. We also have some really great audience questions. One of them is, given the existing work that other standard setting bodies are doing, including IEEE, ISO, and NIST, why do we need a special standard setting body for AI? And how do you view these AVOs/standard committees in relation to these other existing standard bodies?
I think that's a great question. You know, NIST, I have a lot of confidence. I've been to NIST in Colorado. It's a great organization, a lot of dedicated people working there. But right now they're under the tutelage of the federal government, which means that NIST has been diminished, and I don't see it as having the direction, the institutional direction to do what needs to be done right now. IEEE has really in the past been focused on electrical, like the Mr. Coffee thing I mentioned earlier, your electrical utilities. There's underwriter laboratories is more like on the mechanical items, your car parts and so on. But none of those, in my opinion, were really focused in the way they need to be focused on AI standards. And so that's kind of why I didn't. Now, it may be that we'll get our bill passed and we'll set it up, and then NIST will come to its feet and start behaving the way it needs to. Again, no reflection on the people at NIST. It's a great organization, but they need to have the federal support to do what they need to do. And right now, the federal government is saying, well, we don't want any regulation on AI. Because on the one hand, they want to compete with China, which is perhaps our biggest rival, and they don't want to harm profit making for the big tech. So there's a lot of resistance to meaningful regulation from Washington. And because of that, I feel since California is the home of AI, we have probably there's no contest. We have the biggest collection of AI firms in the country and probably in the world, that we should assume that responsibility and take leadership in this area.
Thank you. And going back to SB 813, another really important set of entities that were mentioned were independent verification organizations. And we were wondering sort of how you're thinking about third-party regulators, including these IVOs and maybe even AI insurance companies, and their role within the AI regulation ecosystem.
Well, yeah, thank you. The framework we have in the bill outlined is to have a government entity, basically a commission, which would be in the government, to oversee the standards committees, which we're calling AVOs. So they would oversee the committees, and the committees could form commercially or however they can. Again, and the language you've written kind of pushes them in the direction of a very diversified set of members. You don't want members that are, you don't want committees that are biased in one way or another. You don't want them to be captured by industry. You don't want the commission to be captured by industry. So we've got safeguards in the legislation to prevent those kinds of things from happening. Another thing you don't want is to have the AVOs, the standards committees, accept what I would call sort of bribes or whatever to get things passed. I mean, there has to be a set of safeguards to make sure that all of the parts work the way they want to, and the way the legislation is written, you need to be recertified as an AVO every few years, and that will help prevent. You can't go from the commission to be an AVO. I mean, there's a lot of safeguards we have in there, and of course, I'm sure, because of the way people work and the way things work, that will need to be modified over time. They'll find holes and gaps and loopholes and get in and do nefarious things. But initially, it'll work, and then it'll just be like most human endeavors. It'll need to be updated in time to make sure that it does what it's supposed to, what the original intent is.
Thank you. Speaking of these kinds of influences, one of the questions we got to was earlier you distinguished political from policy decisions. Could you please elaborate on what you mean by that?
Okay. There's, I mean, developing, I'll go back to Washington, if you'll allow me for a minute. The way things work in Washington, there's a Speaker of the House who really decides on what happens, what legislation comes to the floor for vote. So, and then there's the committees. The committees develop the legislation, and then they'll go to the Speaker and say, Speaker, can we bring this legislation to the floor? And the Speaker will make a political decision. Now, the chairs and the committees are policy parts of the body. The committee is where the expertise lies. People that are on the committee have been on the committee for 25 years. You have staffers that have been on that committee for 15, 20 years. So these are people that are really enmeshed in these issues, whether it's AI or healthcare or all the fields, national defense, cybersecurity. I mean, these are people that have devoted years and years of their life to understanding these things. And so they're focused on policy. They want to make sure that the legislation they write is going to make an improvement in an existing situation. That's my microphone. They want to make sure that the policies that they produce are beneficial to society. Now, when they go to the Speaker has another set of objectives, and that is the Speaker is a very powerful position. And if you know anything about people in power, they don't like to give up power. And so the Speaker is going to look at the legislation and say, okay, if I put this legislation on the floor, is it going to cost my party? Am I going to lose enough seats so that the other party gets a majority and I'm no longer the Speaker? So there's political decisions, and then there's policy decisions. And I hope that made that clear enough.
Thank you. Moving maybe to a different area of AI regulation, one of the questions we got was that the governance of AI should include environmental impacts. How can we ensure that humans have water and power rights?
That's an ongoing question. Right now, there were 3 bills in this session. Let's talk about data centers, because that's probably part of the question. how do we make sure that data centers don't cause problems for society? Are they going to use up so much energy that there's brownouts, that there's pollution, that it raises your rates? Is it going to cause emissions of carbon dioxide? Is it going to use a lot of water? In California, we care a lot about water. So those are some of the questions that people have. And so, I had a proposal that would charge, if your nameplate rating of your data center was maybe 25 megawatts, then when your nameplate rating is over 25 megawatts, then you're going to have to pay for that difference. But there's other ways that are being proposed, I think that are being considered, and there's also the possibility that my ideas will be merged with some of the other ideas to find something that's actually even better. And so that's the way the process should work. We want to make sure that when we produce data centers in California, that they don't harm the consumers, they don't harm the environment, and that another thing I care deeply about with AI, and I'm sure this audience will care too, is the concentration of wealth that's happening with the tech industry. How do we prevent what's happening in the tech industry exaggerating that already very big disparity of wealth in this country and around the world? So those are some of the things that we are trying to put guardrails in place, and that's our job to do that.
Thank you so much. If I remember correctly, I think there was also a bill in progress, SB 1011, on ratepayers and data centers. If you could speak more on that, that would be interesting as well. There's also another question about the concentration of wealth and power, and one audience asks, how much power does California have in passing effective AI regulation, given that big tech CEOs are in Trump's pocket?
I mean, that's a tough question, and that's what we're struggling with. Exactly what we're struggling with. There's no question in my mind that we're going to pass in Sacramento several pieces of AI legislation that will form some sort of protection, from some aspect of artificial intelligence. We'll probably pass 15 of those bills this year. Okay, and last year we passed, about 4 or 5. I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there on how to regulate AI, but again, as I mentioned, this is regulation. Regulation is slow. Regulation takes legislation and is slow. So I'm worried about whether those are going to be effective in the long run. But as your first name? Ruchi pointed out, that the federal government is opposed to regulation. So how do we regulate in the face of a federal government? They had a bill last year that would have preempted all state regulation on artificial intelligence, all of it. Now, it got a lot of support, and then the people in the United States pushed back, and so they tamped that one down. But the president, and I don't want to say his name, put out an executive order to preempt all state regulatory, and that doesn't have the force of law. That is what the president wants, and that's going to be adjudicated in the courts over the next few years. So we'll see where that goes, but that goes back to why I produced a standards body, a voluntary standards regime, so that they can't say, well, this is regulation. I can say, well, it's not a regulation, it's a voluntary standard. So we can put into place safeguards created with industry's input, and it should have industry's input, and hopefully stand up to federal challenges in court as to whether that's legal or not.
Yeah, going to voluntary standards, another question from the audience is, what is your view on the opinion that regulations or standards frameworks may restrict or stifle innovation?
That's a good question. And again, that's always a possibility, and that's one of the arguments that comes out of Washington. It's an argument that's leveled against the European Union. They've got their EU AI bill, and there's a lot of folks that think, well, geez, that has really stifled AI development in Europe. And people point to that and say, well, that's why we don't want to do that here, because their top scientists, they claim, are coming to the United States or to Canada or someplace that doesn't have that. And there's some legitimacy in that. It's just that we can't throw up our hands and say, well, we're just going to let AI have its way with us, because that's dangerous and it's going to cause unemployment. I see unemployment as a huge challenge, because if we start displacing more and more people, then society is going to become more and more restless, and it's going to want change, the kind of change we saw on January 6th of 2021. We don't want that. So putting standards in place, putting guardrails in place is needed. But if we create it in standards bodies, then industry will have its representation and its voice heard, and that'll prevent the most challenge to innovation, I think, is having industry involved in the discussion.
Thank you. So going to the last two questions now that you mentioned the EU, let's go a little international here.
Okay.
Do you have thoughts on how powerful countries like US and China will collaborate at the international level for the enforcement of a unified AI policy? And will trust be a factor in letting this happen or not letting this happen?
Well, funny that you mentioned trust. That's one thing that's sorely lacking in tech right now, with good reason. Tech has taken our data, and it's using it to create enormous wealth for a very limited number of people. And I think that, and it's causing some harms on society. So how do we deal with that? And I don't see any possibility of the US and China collaborating on AI regulations or AI safeguards unless we have an international standards regime. It doesn't have to be California's, but it could be a standard regime that includes participation from China or any body that has dissenting information, dissenting viewpoints ought to be included in those decisions that create standards. And that way, I think we can. Now, the way we've designed SB 813 is that it's scalable. Once we get the standards regime established here in California, other states can jump on, they can participate in the standards bodies. There's nothing in the bill that says that the standards committees or the AVOs have to be people from California. They can be people, there's no restriction whatsoever. You can have somebody from China, you can have somebody from any place else in the world. And I think that'll give it more credibility and more power in terms of the kind of safeguards that needs to be in place without needlessly stifling innovation.
Thank you. And for the last question, this is from someone in the audience. She writes, I met you in 2009 at an NOAA reception on the Hill while serving as a AAAS fellow and was impressed with your impact then and now. How might you recommend researchers engage with policymakers in a helpful way? I will also add to that as a person with a PhD in math and at the Simons Institute, we were wondering sort of how your sort of foundational training in math helps sort of your policy impact today.
Okay, the first part of that question, are you a math PhD?
No.
Oh, okay, I thought you.
But a lot of people here do theoretical computer science.
Okay, I'm the first part of the question is, I think, and I mentioned this earlier, I mean, you all here are the researchers. You are the ones that see probably into the future the best. And so it's important that you get engaged not only with research, but with us policymakers so that we can benefit from your understanding and knowledge. I mean, and how do you do that? Well, it's hard if you're sitting in an ivory tower. How do you reach out to someone that's in a different sort of environment? It's not easy, but it's worth the effort. And engaging, you can engage in many ways, but establishing a contact in the capital, in this case in Sacramento, is really important. And if you engage, and people hate lobbyists, they say lobbyists are the problem. Lobbyists aren't the problem. The problem is money in politics. That's the problem. Lobbyists are just one of those elements. But establish a relationship with a lobbyist that knows Sacramento or that knows Washington, and use that lobbyist to gain entrance into the proper a policymaker or the appropriate policymaker's office or committee. That's how you get in, is by working with somebody that knows the system, that knows who to go to, that knows what the proper committee is, what the appropriate member of the Senate or the Assembly is. That's how you do it. And then it's like you establish relationships. Once you establish a relationship with somebody, it's harder for that person to say no. I mean, that's just common sense. You go, you meet him a few times or her a few times. You go out to dinner. You go to one of their functions, and talk to them about issues. And over time, you develop a relationship, and then you say, hey, there's an issue I have with this part of AI. Can I ask for your support? And then, it's hard to say no to somebody that you have a relationship with. So that's really, it takes time, but it's the effort. We have Michelle, she left. Oh, Michelle Moskowitz, stand up, Michelle.
Hey. Hi, everyone.
She's our liaison from Cal to Sacramento. So work with somebody like Michelle, and we can start developing those relationships and starting understanding your ideas that might be beneficial. And then moving from getting a technical degree in engineering or science, the transition to politics is a tough one. I mean, when I first started running back in '04, the war in Iraq was a motivator. I was very angry that we were doing an unjust war. But making the transition to being a politician was very, very, very hard. I mean, I could get up and lecture about tensors and stuff like that, but talking about policy in front of people, it was a challenge. And you just have to do whatever it takes. I mean, you have to have the fire in your gut, in your belly, to get up there and do it. And fighting an unjust war was a big motivator. But there's other motivators. If you're worried about AI's impact on society, that's a big motivator. If you're worried about homelessness out there, you're stepping over people, you might be homeless yourself. I mean, these are that's what it takes. And in my case, I went to a speaking coach. Public speaking was a nightmare, and it didn't help. I went to a psychiatrist. It didn't help. I went to an acting coach. Bingo, that helped. So you just have to find what works for you. And you have to be motivated enough because it's a tough transition. Sitting on the phone 20 hours a week begging people for money, I mean, that's hard. That's just hard. It's like crawling over crushed glass. But if you want to go, you got to make those challenges. You got to meet those challenges if you want to become a policymaker. It's a tough road.
Thank you so much, Senator McNerney. Please join me in thanking him once again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.